thank you very much for this kind invitation. I'm very delighted to represent the Wilfried Martens Centre for European Studies. It's the official think tank of the European People's Party, and here together with our Czech partner of the IKPD. Well, I would like to go right into the question of our panel from a perspective of a political think tank and a policy consultant. So is freedom of religion talked about sufficiently? Well, in my opinion, the answer is neither yes nor no. Yes, we have definitely a lot of legal frameworks, and Baroness Cox mentioned these on the national level, the regional level, and even the global level, and they are regularly updated and reflect, of course, the changes, the new threats we see in the persecution of faith and believers. And there are a lot of debates in the, at least, Western parliaments. So from this part, the things are not so bad, but we have to ask, if we assume that there is really a deteriorating situation for many religions and groups in the world, there must be apparently a lot of loopholes. And against this background, the answer is no. There's not enough discussion and action. You might find my position a bit paradoxical, but let me try to explain why I come to this conclusion. And I have chosen 3 topics which I would like to elaborate a bit and which I think are often ignored in the analysis and also in the development of strategies in this policy field. To some extent, I will reflect a bit on the situation in Germany and in Europe because they reflect a certain environment, and we have to understand why the situation is as it is. I start with the first point, and that is the relation between policies related to promoting or protecting at least freedom of faith and other policy fields. And Baroness Cox has, I think, already slightly touched upon that topic. Well, one must acknowledge that in many European states there is no systematic reflection on the dimension of freedom of faith in bi- and multilateral cooperation projects. It is not an integral part of the policy design of most EU projects, and I take this field first. Despite that, we are always claiming, and Europeans are very good in claiming, that the human rights aspects is always part and has to be approved before you run the projects. But it is not often the case that they are aware on the level of the implementation of projects and among those people who are really responsible for projects in the field. And I lived many years abroad in Asia Pacific. I was working in the field of development cooperation, and I can see really that this was never a dimension, regardless what we talked about, human rights. The religious dimension, the faith dimension was always, I must say, systematically kept out. I have the impression that the European Union and most of the member states, in particular in the Western European sphere, are a bit horrified by being blamed for hidden agents for Christian missioning. That is one of the explanations I have. Because when they are called to react to these violations, which are obvious, they often go to a very neutral language of abstract human rights or rely on other factors such as ethnicity or gender. But I don't think that this is a useful attitude because it leaves out the main aspect, which is religion as a factor. And by the way, there is another negative effect of this attitude. Even if we are not confronted with actions of violation of faith, the effectiveness of our international cooperation, for example, in development cooperation, is very low if we do not take into account the dimension of faith and religion. We leave it out, and we often then are wondering ourselves why it doesn't work, because we ignore that this is a really constitutive factor in societies and for the identity of societies. Why is this so? What could be an explanation? I think there is one topic. First of all, we have not to blame, in this case, the politicians and parliaments for not being active. We have to blame them for many other things, but I think this does definitely not go true for initiatives related to the freedom and the defense of freedom of faith. We have many commissions, many initiatives, and many working groups. But let's be honest, if you ask ordinary people on the street, hardly anyone has heard about these initiatives or is even interested in these topics. And I think that is not surprising at all because, well, we have undergone a massive wave of secularization in Western European societies. Faith or religion is no longer a topic of public interest. And even parties who have the C in their name as Christian Democratic Union, for example, in Germany, they are struggling with this element of faith, with its heritage and with the ideological fundaments. And of course, against that background, they are very hesitant to actively promote this topic in the public debate. And in addition to that, and I must say this is really sad, the current dominating medial and cultural discourse is often definitely anti-Christian or anti-religious. As a whole, we are dealing with anti-colonialism, anti-racism, and anti-gender issues. That's all fine, but as I mentioned before, if you leave out the dimension of religion, of faith, then you miss the very point in these debates. And this is something which I see more and more. And so, for the politicians, let's be clear, this topic is a no-winner topic. So they have no interest to deal. And how shall we find public support or public movements to stand up for the defense of faith, at least in Western Europe? I would like to close with a third point, and that might be even a bit more provocative. And here I will reflect a bit on the role of religious communities in the promotion or persecution of faith. Well, it is often said that interreligious dialogue, and our event is one of those things today, should and could be an important instrument in raising awareness and to cross the boundaries of religious communities. Well, in first hindsight, I think this is a valid point, but I would like to challenge this view because, unfortunately, it's not often state-driven violence which leads to the violation or persecution of believers. It's often deliberately incited violence inside societies and, unfortunately, religious communities often play a fatal role, often not the mainstream religious, but also some radical groups. So we have to call, I'm quite convinced of that, to call for a more realistic approach in these interfaith religious dialogues. We must be very careful in choosing the right partners, and we have to understand the situation on the ground, the dynamics in these societies. And we have to call also for conditionality and reciprocity in this kind of dialogue. It's not a one-way attempt. We have to ask this from our partners as well. This is a very time-consuming effort. This is not a big, visible public event. That is hard work, daily work on the ground. But I think for those who suffer from the persecutions and violations is something which makes a difference way more. This is hard political work, but sooner or later we have to come to this. So thank you very much for your attention. I'm very much looking forward to the discussion later on. Thank you.